But it was my contention when I began to write this book that in Jamaican parlance, half the story has not been told, because the attention seems to have been focused almost entirely on Bob Marley over the last 30 years or so, at the exclusion of Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer. And actually, these three boys met as teenagers. They were together for 10 years. They went through many peaks and troughs. And what I'm doing in my book is I'm reuniting them, because they were like a band of brothers in a way. They were all tied up blood-wise as well, which I'll get into. So in a way, if you do buy this book, you will get a treat, because it's 3 books in one. Because on the one hand, it's a biography of the Wailers, Bob Marley, Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer. It's also a social history of Jamaica. I'm primarily a historian, that's what interests me, the social background of where these guys came from. And then there's a kind of travelogue. I'm of Jamaican ancestry, my parents are Jamaican. I'm actually from Luton, but I've been traveling back and forth between Luton and Kingston, Luton and Trenchtown for the last 20 years. So I pop up, and with some anecdotes, I flesh out some of the themes of the book. Now, in the course of researching I I TheNatural Mystics, I came across an interesting fact, I think, and that is that the Wailers first got their break on a Jamaican equivalent to Britain's Got Talent. It was a variety show called Opportunity Hour, presided over by this man here in the middle, Veer Johns. Now, Veer Johns was copied by a man called Huey Green. I don't know whether you're old enough to remember Huey Green. It's a variety show where they had many kinds of different acts. There were rumba dancers, there were acrobats, there were tap dancers, magicians, and there were also harmony singers. And if you performed at this Opportunity Hour, you would have one shot at fame, one chance at fame to go through and become the local star, unless you got on the right side of Veer Johns, literally, because Veer Johns was blind in one eye. And if you got on the left side of him, he wouldn't recognise that you'd been on before, and you'd have another chance. And it was said by Peter Tosh. Can we go on to a couple more? I'll tell you to stop. Keep going. Once more, once more, once more, and once more, and once more. Stop. It was said by Peter Tosh, it's on the right here, that when the guys performed, the crowd went wild once more. And when they performed, actually, they were a prototype rhythm and blues band. They adored Curtis Mayfield, and they wore these wonderful two-tone suits and had blue-creamed hair. And my book actually charts the way that they evolved. And you can chart the evolution of the Wailers through the way that they changed their clothes. So they went from this look to wearing battle fatigues and dreadlocks in the course of 10 years. And that's the story, really. But when they performed at this variety show, if you can go back to that variety show, Rachel, is it Rachel? Rebecca, yeah. When they performed at the variety show, the crowd was so enthralled by their performance. They had spent many hours rehearsing on Hellshire Beach, and they did splits and they did flips, and they had real showbiz flair. And the crowd went wild, and they showered the stage with coins. And at the end of the performance, the people realized that they were just as poor as the boys on stage, and they came back and begged back the money. Every person begged back the coin that they'd thrown. And in a way, I love that story because it shows you that these boys, they were teenagers at the time, were local heroes. They were adored by the local people from Trenchtown, where they all met. Now, the boys came from the countryside. Each one of the Wailers came from the countryside in Jamaica, as many people do, to the city. But they came from the deep countryside, the bush, as we say in Jamaica. The sort of place where people would cut up car tires to use as shoes. They called them power shoes. They would fashion cricket balls out of mango stones, and banana leaves would be cut up to use as umbrellas. And when they came to Trenchtown, they came to what became a ghetto, but it wasn't always built as thus. In fact, Trenchtown was built in the 1940s initially as an exercise in social housing. the best kind of social housing. It was built by the equivalent to the Lever brothers here, the philanthropists. And they had great ideals. They actually bought the land from the Trench family. The Trench family were a Scottish family who were they owned land, but they didn't live in Jamaica. Many of the landowners didn't live. They had overseers who oversaw the land for them, but they didn't live there. So the Trench family sold the land to the philanthropists. They built Trench Town, but they ran out of money. And it led to what became known as the scandal bag scenario. So they didn't have enough money to build a proper sewage system. So here's what happens. In the wee hours of the morning, when you need to go for a poo, you poo into the plastic scandal bag. And then you peer through your window or the door, make sure no one's looking, and you creep to the edge of the trench town and you throw your scandal bag out onto the other mountain of other scandal bags. So it was an area of much privation, and they would have very poor water system. They had what we call a standpipe system. One standpipe would provide water for a number of families for washing, cooking, cleaning. And in a way, these guys, these young boys, they were teenagers when they met, were what we call in Jamaica force ripe. You know when you may have done this, you have fruit and it's not quite ready, and you ripen it before it's ready. These boys had to become older than they actually were, more mature than they were because of the hardship of the lives around them. I started the book in 1940s. And in a way, this book is a follow-on from my previous book. Who knows who this guy is? Jasmine, you mustn't say, because Jasmine knows, because Jasmine's my daughter. But Marcus Garvey. This is Marcus Messiah Garvey. And Marcus Garvey, in his day, is a Jamaican. He went to Harlem in New York. And in his day, he was the most famous black man on the planet, bar none. He led a huge movement in North America and in the Caribbean and Africa called the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And Marcus Garvey was a lion of a man. He was a huge man, huge personality. He had a silver tongue. He was a great orator. And when he spoke mostly at the beginning at Speaker's Corner in Harlem, in New York, on 135th Street. They had their own Speaker's Corner. And it was said that he had a voice like God. He had a voice like thunder. But it wasn't just the tone and the timbre of his voice, it was what he was saying. He tapped into the dreams and aspirations of a despised but awakening people. Black people at the time, in the 1920s, were at the footstool of society. And Garvey famously said, "Up, you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will." At his peak, Marcus Messiah Garvey had up to 6 million followers, maybe more. Over 1,000 branches in America, Africa, the Caribbean. And many, many enemies. So he made an enemy of Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover. He made an enemy of the British military intelligence and the other colonial authorities who feared that his message, if it got to Africa, would incite rebellion. So he had this huge movement, but he made these enemies. He was arrested for this thing called mail fraud. It's a trumped-up charge. He was arrested, spent some time in jail. By 1940 now, Marcus Garvey is back in London, and he. Who knows how he dies? Anyone know? Good. So Marcus Garvey is 1940, he's alone now, his movement has dwindled. And he has a small retinue around him. And he's in a small rented house in West London. And one day he opens a newspaper and he reads a headline which he knows cannot be true. And the headline is, "Marcus Garvey dies in London." And it's a caustic obituary, it's a very nasty obituary. It's saying that he was a charlatan, he was a buffoon, he was a disgrace to the race. And other papers pick up this story and publish equally damning obituaries. And after reading so many of these obituaries, Marcus Garvey suffers a heart attack and dies. His obituaries kill him. And that's how I started that book. But this book, equally, is a book that follows on from that moment. So, he dies in 1940. My guys now are all born in the 1940s, and they're born in rebellion. In 1938, there was rebellion on the island in Jamaica. Tate and Lyle opened a new sugar estate, a sugar plant. But they imported these English managers who brought with them some rather unsatisfactory managerial practices. They didn't pay people enough money. It was a rebellion. It was a bloody rebellion. And I know this because my mother is also in the book. One of the things I do in the book is I try to introduce many people who were alive at the time who can tell the background to the story. So my mother's father was a policeman, and in Jamaica at the time it was rough to be a black policeman because you had to do things which were against your instincts. Because the majority of the black people in Jamaica are that, they are black. And they were told to shoot and shoot to kill. Many people died in that rebellion. This is a sculpture of Negro Rouse, which came out of that spirit of the Negro now free from slavery. But the rebellion led to the beginning of the first political parties in Jamaica. This man here, Buster Manti, was one of the first leaders in Jamaica. And it's important to introduce that because, in a way, the guys that I now write about were born in bloodshed. They're born in the spirit of rebellion. Buster Manti famously, at this rebellion, he confronted the troops who had their pistols with their bayonets drawn. And he famously pulled open his shirt, stood on a roof of a car and said, "Don't shoot my people, shoot me." He became this champion of the people, which is rather strange actually, because Buster Manti, before that, had been a moneylender. And he would chase the poorest tenants through the courts for no matter the small amount of money that they owed him. And yet he underwent this huge transformation to become this champion of the people, which is something you find again and again in America, in Jamaica, these strange contradictions. So my guys are born in rebellion, and by 1960s they meet in Trenchtown. One of the interesting things that I riff on in the book is why Bob Marley was elevated and the other two, Bunny Wailer, Bob Marley and Peter Tosh, were rather eclipsed. Now, you cannot really write about Jamaica unless you write about colour and class. Now, Bob Marley was a fair-skinned black boy. I say fair-skinned because he had a so-called white father, Norval. I say so-called because in Jamaican parlance we say that Norval was touched by the tar brush. He wasn't fully white, but he was socially white. We can go back. But he abandoned Bob Marley as a baby, in fact. And in this picture now, Bob's 16 or thereabouts with Sidella, his mother, and Pearl, his sister. And this is a very poignant photograph because she's about to leave, go to America to work some money, as we say. Now Bob Marley, this fair-skinned boy, fair-skinned black boy in Trenchtown would have been an unusual sight. Because what you have to remember, I'm sure many people know this, that Jamaica is a pigmentocracy. In essence, if you imagine a pyramid, the black people, the majority of black people are at the bottom of the pyramid. They form the bulk of the pyramid, and they're the poor people. And towards the top now you have the brown elite and then the white people. In a way, you can think about Jamaica by thinking about that playground song. There's a brown girl in the ring. Do you know that song? There's a brown girl in the ring. Tra-la-la-la-la. Do you know that song? It was made famous by Boney M. Now that song is a slave song. So here's the derivation of that song. So the brown girl in the middle of the ring is the product of a white slave man and a black slave woman. Slave man, I mean slave owner. Now she's in the middle. Holding hands around her are the black girls. They're the product of a black slave man and black slave woman. So the brown girl in the middle will get the sugar, will get the sweet things in life. And the black girls holding hands around her will have to make do with the plum, the sour things in life. And that's the way the society was arranged in Jamaica. And largely, to some extent, is still arranged in that way in Jamaica. So Bob Marley would have been an unusual sight, because in the 60s in Jamaica, at that time, especially in places like the ghettos of Trenchtown, white people were loathed because of the things that had gone on in the past. And it's my contention that Bob Marley had to be very nimble and to disabuse people of the prejudices that they would have had about him, because the brown people were aligned with the white people. And so Bob Marley was so conscious of his colour and so wanted to align himself with the black people that it is said that he got Rita Marley to rub black shoe polish in his hair to make it coarser and for him to appear more African. And as I was saying, I think it's very important to understand this notion of race in Jamaica. And it's a rather vexed question, which I think some other writers are a little bit frightened to write about. So I'm going to read a little extract from the book now where I pop up. And this, I think, gives some illustration of the complexity of race in Jamaica. So I work for the BBC. I'm a radio producer. That's how I get my money. There's no money to be made from writing books, as I'm sure you all know. Here I am on the road from Montego Bay to Kingston with a white colleague in a hire car. I'll have to take my glasses off actually, because I'm resisting bifocals, so I'm pretending to be younger than I am. So, here we are. The sun was high and extremely hot. The hire car was cool, and my companion frowned every time I opened the window a crack. It was nearing 100 degrees outside. The final stretch of road was bordered by a never-ending line of rough wooden huts selling fruit. My companion suggested that we stop for an orange or banana, but I was reluctant to break the journey. At least, I argued, we could hold on until we found a reasonable-looking stall. The next one was bound to have a better selection, riper, more varied, more golden, not so bruised. But as we approached the city and the countryside receded, the drop-off in the quality of the fruit became more pronounced. I regretted not stopping earlier. Eventually, when it became clear that any further delay was futile, wishful thinking, the fruit would not improve from now on, we pulled over at the very next stall. A large, well-fed woman sat beside the hut, barely protected from the sun. A rag rested on her lap, which she occasionally took to wipe the sweat from her face. She looked up momentarily as the ding, ding, ding of the opening car door sounded, and my passenger emerged and dashed to the shade of the stall, strangely like someone hurrying out of the rain. The woman at the shack held a knife in one hand, which she used to cut into the thick skin of an orange. The peel dropped down in a kiss curl as the knife went to work. The stall was brimful of bananas, rows and rows of them, less a sign of prudent replenishing of stock than testament to the very few sales she had managed all day. The bananas were not in good shape. They were overripe and beginning to turn. My companion gingerly picked up a hand of bananas, and immediately, just through the force of gravity, the near rotting fingers fell off. The stallholder looked on, remaining in his seat, all the while peeling the orange with a knife, but muttering now, "She mashed my bananas. Who tells she for mash my bananas?" My fellow traveller, scanning the stall intensely, seemed unaware of what the woman was saying. She beckoned me out of the car, but as soon as I reached there, she turned and said, "Oh, I don't think I'll bother. They're all off." She retraced her steps, hurrying out of the sun towards the car, and slid back into the passenger seat. The banana seller shot up from the stool, and as I moved to get back into the car, she blocked my path. "She mashed my bananas." "Pardon?" "She mashed my bananas. Who tells she for mash my bananas?" "I'm sorry," I said, "but I think they're all rotten." I opened the driver's side door. The woman held it by the edge. "Them can't sell now. Now she mashed them. Them can't sell." "He doesn't want any," I said firmly. The heat was overpowering. I blinked away the sweat from my eyes and made another effort to get back into the car, but she wouldn't budge. The woman suddenly screamed, "Call the police!" "What?" "Call the police!" I looked along the empty road stretching on and on, with no village or town in sight and no police. "Be my guest," I suggested. "Yes, go ahead." "You call them," she shouted, "on your phone." I explained, no longer hiding my irritation, that I didn't have a phone. "Just because you is white," she said. "Think you can treat people so?" I didn't understand what she meant. I wasn't as dark as her. I hadn't spent all day in the punishing sun, but I was undeniably black. "Just because you is white." She sliced off a bit of the orange and, chewing angrily on it, turned and appealed to the other stallholders. I took the chance while she was temporarily distracted to jump into the car, but before I could shut the door, I felt something hit my neck. In the shock, I thought she had cut me. I turned the key in the ignition and we sped off. It was only after a few miles that I felt brave enough to stop and inspect the damage. The collar of my shirt was stained orange. She had spat the orange at me. Now, I don't think I come out of that story particularly well. Now, I think it does show the complexities of race, class, and colour in Jamaica. One of the things I also riff on is this Peter Smile. We'll get back to that. Prototype raster. Keep going. There we go. So one of the things I riff on is Rastafari. Now, again, you can't really understand the Wailers unless you understand Rastafari. The Wailers became Rastafarians. And I'll show you this picture here because this picture shows the Scatolites, who backed the early Wailers, who they called the Teenagers. Because the Wailers, they were harmony singers, they weren't musicians. So they were backed by these guys, and these guys were the consummate musicians in Jamaica. They all trained at the Alpha Boys Reform School, and they included Don Drummond and people like that. They're brilliant musicians. Now, in 1962, Jamaica becomes independent. In 1964, there's a World Trade Fair in New York. So all the nations of the world send the best of their country to New York to show the world what they can do. So Jamaica should have sent these guys here. Instead, they sent Millie Small, who made that song My Boy Lollipop, which is a nice song, a nice saccharine song. So they sent Millie Small. They should have sent these guys. They didn't send these guys. Why? Because these guys were Rastafarians. Now, the Rastafarians in Jamaica in the 50s and 60s were the dirty, barefoot, nasty Negadem. They were dirty. They were Bagawa people. They smelled. They wore rags. They lived in the gutter. They were feckless. They produced an army of children. They were work shy. No one would have anything to do with them. So why would you become a Rastafarian? Here's why. In 1966. Yeah. So the outcast Rastafarians, as you might know, revere Haile Selassie as a god. In a way, there's a link between Selassie and Garvey. Marcus Garvey predicted the coming of Haile Selassie. In 1930, Marcus Garvey, when black people were despised at the footstool of society, said, look to the east, read your Bible and look to the east. Princes shall come out of Egypt, and God shall hold open his hands unto Ethiopia. And lo and behold, in 1930, the impossible happens. Haile Selassie is crowned Emperor of Ethiopia. George V sends his son. The European powers send tributes. They kneel at his feet. This black man is crowned Emperor. And when the news spread to places like Jamaica, people are electrified. And immediately, almost overnight, some people name themselves after him. So one other name for Haile Selassie is Ras Tafari, Prince of the Tafari, Rastafarians. They name themselves after him. And in 1966, the great god comes from the sky. On a state visit on April the 21st, 1966, Selassie arrives in Jamaica. And the plane touches down, and there are thousands of Rastafarians on the tarmac at the main airport in Jamaica. They're smoking their chillum pipes, they're blowing their horns, they're ululating, they have their flags, they're flashing their dreadlocks. And Haile Selassie looks out of his window and he's petrified. He won't get off the plane. For an hour, the plane idles on the tarmac until somebody has the brilliant idea to send for Mortimer Plano. Mortimer Plano is this man in the middle here in a white gown. Mortimer Plano is a Rastafarian elder. He's 36. He's a Rastafarian elder. He's a street intellectual. He's revered by people in Trenchtown, but he's also known by the authorities as this bright guy. So they call for Plano. Plano ascends the steps. He turns and he commands the crowd to move. And rather like Moses parting the Red Sea, the crowd parts. And Selassie descends and begins his state visit. One of the first things that Selassie does, he goes to the king's house and he invites Rastafarians to the king's house. You can't get any higher in Jamaica than the king's house. So you have these dirty barefoot Rastas going to the king's house. Overnight, the impression of Rasta changes. And overnight, songs start to be written about Rastafari, about Selassie. One of the first songs that come after this moment is written by a man called Peter Tosh. He wrote a song called Rasta Shook Them Up. Rasta shook up society, which they surely did. And they lived this life of liberty. When I was interviewing people for the book, one of the people I interviewed was a man called Benjamin Foote. Now, Benjamin Foote was a tour manager for the Wailers when they first came to England, and they weren't known. And I asked Benjamin what it was like working with them. Benjamin Foote was the son of the governor of Jamaica. Catch the irony. At the beck and call of these Rastafarians now. And he's saying that he'd be in this beaten up minivan, going up and down the M1 motorway with them, going to small venues, small pubs, polytechnics. And he said that they would be arguing non-stop. But they weren't arguing about the usual things. They weren't arguing over girls. They weren't arguing over the running order of songs. They were arguing over scripture. He said it was like being in a seminary. They were down the line Rastafarians. And they lived and breathed this idea of Rasta, of liberty, of living close to the land, of embracing God. I and I. God in me. God resides in me all the time. So they were fundamentally Rastafarians, and shrewdly this man here used them. Around about the same time in America, there's a young boxer called Cassius Clay who fought an ogre called Sonny Liston and became world champion. And what's the first thing that Cassius Clay did when he became world champion? He changed his name to Muhammad Ali. He renounced his slave name. Now, Elijah Muhammad, founder of the Nation of Islam, used Muhammad Ali to popularize the Nation of Islam. Mortimer Plano used the Wailers, used Burning Spear to popularize Rastafari. So almost overnight now you have this connection between reggae and Rasta, and that's how it evolved. Can we go back now? Because one of the things I riff on is why the guys split. The guys went through many peaks and troughs. In fact, they had their first hit in '63 with Simmer Down, which is a Rude Boys song. Now, the Rude Boys were these sort of unemployed boys who had shapeless lives, but they had style and violence. And Simmer Down is a call for the Rude Boys to calm down, to simmer down. So they had a hit with that, but to have a hit in Jamaica in the charts, you only need to sell 8,000 copies. And every producer whom they worked with ripped them off. And it didn't matter what colour you were in Jamaica, if you're a producer, you ripped the stars off. So they were ripped off again and again and again. But in 1972, an amazing thing happened. There was a film released called The Harder They Come. You know this film? The Harder They Come. Which is a film which popularised reggae, really. And it made a star of a man called Jimmy Cliff. Now, Jimmy Cliff, before that film, had been groomed by this man here. This is Chris Blackwell, the head of Island Records. Chris Blackwell groomed Jimmy Cliff to become this huge star, this huge international star. The film was released, it was a big success, Jimmy Cliff became a star, and what's the first thing that Jimmy Cliff did to thank Chris Blackwell? He left Chris Blackwell. So Chris Blackwell was bereft now. He was like a lover whose lover leaves him. But he's hoping against hope that the lover will return. You know, when your lover's left, you put their dressing gown on the back of the door, just in case. There's a small chance. Come on now. So Chris Blackwell's hoping that Jimmy will return. But no, Jimmy doesn't return. But lo and behold, 3 months later, something better happens. Something better arrives, as it always does. 3 guys come through the door. My guys here, Bunny, Bob, and Peter. And they are nobodies. But Chris Blackwell says they have this huge presence. They're like these huge stars. They have attitude. And he recognizes immediately that they have star potential.